Before you can make effective use of the accounts receivable system, one of the first steps you will need to do is establish your accounts receivable parameters. To navigate, you would go to accounts receivable, maintenance, and the very last item on the menu is parameters. Of course, my parameters are going to be set up at the moment, but we'll go through the process of just identifying what needs to go in each of the fields that's there. The first field that we'd come to is the control account. Now this will act as the default accounts receivable control account for all of your customers. Often, for a smaller organisation, a smaller business, you would only have a single accounts receivable account, and this is simply establishing what that default account number is. And that account number itself will actually be asked for in customer maintenance. In larger organisations, and certainly if your organisation is dealing with customers where you are collecting money in foreign currencies, you might be selling in US dollars or euro or something similar, then certainly at least each of those currencies is going to need its own unique debtor control account associated with it as well. The next two accounts that are asked are the sales account and cost of goods sold account. While you have to enter something into these accounts, be aware that they're being transitioned out. They don't actually get used within the system, so the entry there is really of no major consequence, but just for completeness, I suppose, you can enter in a valid sale account and cost of sale account. The next real account of substance for us is a discount account. The discount general ledger account will need to be, or indicates the general ledger account that is normally used when people take discounts, or you actually offer people discounts off their final payments. So this is where you're processing their cash receipts into the system. Now once more, if you are using multiple currencies, you would need to have discount accounts across each of those currencies. Likewise, if for some reason you are breaking up your debtors into various classes, maybe retail debtors, wholesale debtors, maybe by market segment or whatever, in terms of the control account, you may wish to have discount accounts broken up in exactly the same way. That choice is yours. Finance account, once more, you can safely ignore it. You may want to put something in there for completeness, but as we no longer provide the facility for people to apply finance charges, legislation these days means that in order to do that you need a moneylender's account, and you probably don't have a moneylender's account. There just needs to be something in there. The bank account would be the default bank account that is used whenever you're processing cash receipts. Now once more, if you're dealing with multiple currencies in terms of your debtors, you would need to have at least one bank account in each of the currencies that you're actually dealing with. You may have more than that, but this is really when you're processing a cash receipt, the system will automatically plug in a bank account for you, and this is simply the account number that's going to be used for that. And it can be overridden on the cash receipt as well if the money is actually going to be directed elsewhere. The cash clearing account, you need to have one of these, and it's used as a transitional clearing account for where you're actually going to be generating a bank deposit out of the bank reconciliation system. If you will, if someone paid you $100 as a check through the mail, you would enter up a cash receipt through the accounts receivable system. One side of that would be a credit against your debtor's control account for the particular customer you're dealing with. The other side, although you have cash in your hand, if you are running your system fully integrated with the bank rec, which is down here, the bank reconciliation, and I would suggest you always would be, then the other side of the entry actually goes to cash clearing. When the cash is posted, it will automatically create a bank deposit for you to be processed through the bank reconciliation system, and that bank deposit would be a debit to the bank account where you actually collected the money from, which once more may be this account, with the offset entry going to the cash clearing account. So the cash clearing account is really just a transitory balance that's going to sit in the system for that period of time between when you process a receipt through the accounts receivable system and when you actually produce and post the bank deposit to the bank through the bank reconciliation system. The round cash to field here is at this stage set up as 5 cents, being the smallest denomination that we actually have in terms of cash. And this is just used in various places throughout the system where we are dealing with cash customers, and obviously you can't really collect from a cash customer a figure like $19.97. You're either going to be collecting $19.95 or you'd be collecting $20. So that cash rounding at the moment within Australia is going to be 5 cents. Other countries, other currencies where you are dealing with physical cash, it would really just correspond to the lowest coin denomination or note denomination in some countries that you actually deal with. And speaking of countries, you would also nominate here on your next field which country you're actually operating from. And in this case I'm operating from within Australia. The next bank of questions deal with various integrations through the system, and I would suggest that most of these you would check as something that you wanted to do. You would always want to run your general ledger system integrated with your accounts receivable system. And once more, at a future release, this question will actually be removed from the system because we're going to force that to be the case. I'm not aware of any of our customers that don't run debtors integrated to the general ledger. Likewise, I would suggest you would always want to run your bank reconciliation fully integrated to the debtors system as well. You would also want to keep a full history of all of the transactions that you have had through the debtors system, so that should always be checked, and once more a future release will see that removed. And likewise, keep document history. If you are producing accounts receivable documents, don't worry if you don't know what those are at the moment. You may not use them in your system, but there's a separate training video that looks for documents, which are really just invoices and credits that you can generate from the system to charge or apply credits to debtor accounts for services typically, but it may also be goods, things that you're producing out of the job costing system that don't impact the inventory system at all. And that's assuming you use inventory. So it's really just a way of producing a document, an invoice or a credit through the accounts receivable system. And if you are doing that, you would obviously want to keep history for those, I would suggest. You'll also notice alongside these there are options for producing various general ledger posting summaries when you're posting accounts receivable transactions, cash, documents, finance charges. Once more, that is something that is being transitioned out, but even so I would suggest that all of those should be checked so that whenever a journal is produced through the system, that journal will also include a portion that shows you exactly where the general ledger entries have actually gone to. As I said, it's unlikely that you're going to have a credit provider's license, so you would not have this finance charges box ticked, and once more that will disappear in a future release. You also have an option here for print cash receipts to be able to actually produce a cash receipt out of your debtors system when you're processing cash receipts. So if you're doing counter transactions and not using things like the point of sale system, but if you wanted to have the ability of actually producing a cash receipt docket to give to a customer, then you can check that box to activate that facility. If I keep going down this first row of checkboxes, the next checkbox is whether you wish to activate a facility called transaction batches. Now there are various places you can enter transactions into the system. We can actually see them up here for the debtors system, accounts receivable transactions, cash, documents and so forth. If you activate transaction batches, what will happen is the system will identify each individual operator who has gone in to enter a transaction into the system. It will stop other operators or other users from being able to access transactions that you as a user have entered, and it will then also give you the added facility of being able to post just your own transactions. So in other words, if you were processing cash, let's say, if you had two people processing cash receipts because you're getting hundreds of checks through the mail each day and it was too much for one person to be able to get through, you may want each of those people to be able to enter their own pile of cash receipts individually and post them individually without regard or reference to the other operator. Now in some organisations they see that as an overhead in terms of there is only one person doing the task, so it's just an extra question that has to be asked basically. But the transaction batches, if you like the idea of allowing people to have exclusive control over transactions that they enter, activate that facility by checking this box. Personally, I think it's generally a good facility to have, but just be aware if Joe Bloggs enters a transaction up, doesn't post or update it for some reason, and is now away on holidays, no one else can get into that transaction unless they're actually logged on as Joe Bloggs to make changes. They can actually be posted by other people because the physical posting update process is separate from the transaction entry, but if you want to be able to get in and amend or look at transactions that were originated by another operator, you would not have the transaction batches activated. If you're using documents, this facility to be able to produce non-stock invoices directly out of the accounts receivable system, if you wanted the ability to be able to enter quantities against each of the bill codes, and if I'm using terms you don't understand, that's fine. You either will learn what they are when you learn about documents because that's part of your business, or you'll never use the facility, so this checkbox is irrelevant to you. But if you wanted to be able to say enter in a quantity for 3, let's say, because if you've done 3 hours worth of labour, that's really what this checkbox is about, whether you want to be able to enter up through documents quantities and individual unit sell prices to have the system do the simple mathematics for you in terms of an extension. Also, whether you want the amounts to default on documents. The amounts in this case would be standard charge amounts on bill codes once more, and if you wanted to have the ability of entering up a standard charge rate against those bill codes to act as a default, for example a standard labour hourly rate, then you would probably check that box. Also the facility of being able to enter multiple jobs on a single invoice. So if you are doing half a dozen different jobs for a customer, you want to give them just one invoice for all of those jobs and close multiple jobs on a single invoice, then you would check this box to facilitate that. If however you only ever wanted to be able to, and indeed never wanted to be able to have multiple jobs closed or referenced on a single document through the accounts receivable system, don't check this box. You also have the similar facility in terms of multiple entities on documents. This has to do once more with the jobs. When you're actually closing jobs, do you want to limit people to only be able to close jobs or reference jobs for the current entity that you are in, or do you want or need them to have the ability of closing jobs or referencing jobs that belongs to an entity other than the entity or cost center, branch, division, whatever terminology you prefer, that belongs to other entities. So if you want to restrict people so that they only or are forced to only enter jobs that pertain to the current entity, you would leave that unchecked. If you wanted to be able to enter documents and reference jobs from any entities, you would check that particular checkbox. Document approval process. If you or someone in authority within the organisation wants or needs to eyeball every document before it goes out, and here once more the general assumption is this would be for someone in a job costing type environment where the dollars involved with your invoices are non-trivial. We may be talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for a progress payment or something similar. If you want to enforce a document approval process which ensures that at least two people look at the document before it goes out, the original person raising the document, who's given access to it by virtue of their security, and then a separate approval process, which has to be someone else. Even if you've entered the document up yourself and you have the ability to approve a document, you cannot approve a document that you have raised yourself. So it means that there need to be at least two people in the organisation. But if your organisation needs that sort of a cross-check to ensure that you don't put invoices out the door for non-trivial sums of money that have errors in them, activate the document approval process, that facility at least, which will give you then the ability to use those approval processes. If you don't have that checked, then it means that it's possible for someone to simply enter a document and print it and post it immediately without it going through a formal approval or review process. If we just have a look at the second column of checkboxes here, we had a look at the general ledger things before. We also looked at whether we wanted to be able to enter up cash receipts. We also have a checkbox that basically says when you're doing cash receipts, the AR cash receipting process, do you want or need the ability to be able to take up credits? Now, I would suggest that most of you do. You're going to get a remittance advice coming through and the person's taken up credits, so you'd want to be able to process that through the accounts receivable cash receipting process. So I'd suggest that that box should always be checked. If you're using the point of sale system, you have an option of excluding from your normal search screens customers that originated and are only used within the point of sale system. Here, unless you're using point of sale, the question is somewhat irrelevant. If you are using the point of sale system, it just gives you the ability to not show point of sale customers in the accounts receivable customer searching facilities. They can still be found through the point of sale system, but it means they're somewhat hidden, at least from the search facilities, directly from the accounts receivable system. The next checkbox here is whether you want to enable or disable defaulting to take place when you're creating a document for a job that in turn was quoted. So if you don't have this checked, then you're not disallowing those defaults, which means that you are allowing the defaults, basically, which means that the invoice that gets produced pertaining to a job is going to look pretty well exactly the same as the quote that you originally produced for the person. The next checkbox is the Casserolo process. Really ignore this. That process doesn't exist in Visage. It's on this screen for compatibility with our classic Accuterm version of the product, so you can safely ignore that particular checkbox. You have an option of being able to automatically allocate customer codes if you wish. We have a few customers that do this, but most don't. They will want to use somewhat meaningful codes for their customers and allocate those codes themselves manually. Now, the code may be a unique number provided by someone like Telstra, being a telephone number. It may be that the customer codes are an alphabetic concatenation or condensation of the customer's name. And that's typically what people do. However, some people do want the system to just allocate customer numbers as sequential numbers, and if you fall into that particular category, then you would check that box to facilitate that. Also, if you operate as a liquor wholesaler, you would be familiar with a thing called the wine equalisation tax. And if your business deals with the wine equalisation tax, you would have this using wet checkbox ticked. Otherwise, you wouldn't worry about that particular facility at all. Um, if you have subscribed to a service from Census called Total Check, which is an address verification service they provide, you can activate full integration from Visage by simply checking this checkbox, which means that you want to use the Total Check facilities provided by Census. If you haven't subscribed to that service, leave the checkbox unchecked. Otherwise, you will not be able to enter addresses manually through the system, and because you aren't a subscription holder for the Census service, you simply wouldn't be able to enter addresses for your customers, which would be a bad thing to do. You also have an option. Some people, when they're doing accounts receivable documents, like to line things up visually by eye when they are actually entering their documents up, to be able to get columns of figures and so forth. To do that within Visage, which by default, as you can see here on the screen, is using a proportional spacing. The I character here in fixed is obviously occupying much less space on the screen than the X. But if you wanted to activate proportional or deactivate proportional fonts when you're entering up documents to be able to get figures or columns of information to align neatly manually by eye, then you would check that checkbox. Otherwise, leave it unchecked and just enter free text in as you normally would. You have two other checkboxes dealing with statements, which indicate whether you would like to be able to email or fax statements. As you using Visage, you have access to the Visage mailer and faxer, and I would suggest that you would always have those checkboxes checked. If we just have a look at this other little box over here as well, which I skipped before, for people that are dealing with order entry invoices, stock invoices, when you're maintaining your customers, you have the ability globally to set a flag to say whether you normally enter in a customer's reference number, which is typically going to be their order number, when they're doing an invoices. Now you can either make that mandatory by default across the board, you can make it optional, so in other words, you don't really care whether you get an order number in or not, or you can say that it has to be mandatory, so you have to enter an order number in, and it also has to be unique. The uniqueness check ensures that two different people don't respond or pick up an email or a fax off a fax machine and enter an invoice in twice, which of course could result in stock being, or double the amount of stock being sent out to a customer. So normally, if people are going to insist on customer orders being entered as mandatory, they would also want to ensure that they're unique. There are certain areas in the system that will break that rule. If you enter up a customer order, there may be multiple deliveries that are generated from that order, so you can, in that case, have multiple invoices created automatically by the system rather than manually entered that will carry the same order number, but that would be the only situation or course of events that would generate that as a general feature. If we come across to the last column of entries here, the first lot is saying or asking you whether you wish to produce a trial balance automatically from the system before you physically roll balances and produce an end of period report. Now the trial balance can either be not generated because you would have done that yourself manually. It can be summary or detailed. So it's really just a way if your procedures are that before you do a end of period roll, remember it could be weekly, fortnightly, strictly 30 days, 14 days, whatever it happens to be, you can have the system automatically produce a trial balance for you as part of that end of period process, just to ensure that you never overlook that particular step. And likewise, in terms of the trial balance format itself, in the headings you can either include an ending date or period end dates for the various age brackets, or simply say that it's outstanding for period 1, 2, 3, or outstanding for 30, 60, 90 days. Here a lot depends on your actual end of periods themselves, or what your accounting period for debtors are. For example, if you are running your debtors with 7-day accounts, then I would suggest that you would want to show your period end date, because obviously showing 30, 60, 90 columns for weekly accounts wouldn't make a great deal of sense. And in terms of the trial balance itself, you also have an option just in terms of width, whether you wanted to show your trial balance with 3 age columns. In other words, if we're talking traditional monthly, it may be current 30, 60, 90 with a phone number, or current 30, 60, 90 with a fax number, or current 30, 60, 90 with an amount paid, or as I have, 30, 60, 90, 120, and or 4 periods, and things that are more than 4 periods old. So it really just indicates what columns you wish to appear on your trial balance. If you are producing documents from the accounts receivable system, the next option is whereabouts those documents are going to get their number sequence from. At the moment, my system is set up to get those using the same sequence of numbers that I use for my order entry invoicing system. However, it's possible for me to allocate my numbers globally from a separate pool, totally distinct from the numbers that are allocated for order entry invoices. I can enter or have the system allocate those numbers for me specific to each individual entity, so each entity has its own unique range of document numbers that will be used, or you can disable the automatic allocation feature entirely, in which case you would be manually supplying your own document numbers. We have a number of people that operate in, say, a job costing environment, and their invoice numbers will relate to customer order numbers or major project numbers, and they will have various components of that document number that indicate clauses or specific timeline projects that have been hit and that are getting progress billed for as part and parcel of their invoice numbers. So generally, I would suggest that this would be one of either entity specific, so that each entity has their own globally, or if you're using documents and also the order entry system where you're billing stock and so forth, you can also elect to have those use a single source of document numbers or invoice numbers between all of the systems. The next 3 questions, ignore, basically, because that facility wants more of those questions there for backwards compatibility with the old classic R5 product. They don't get used within the Visage system at all. And likewise, the inquiry transaction dates, you have the ability of being able to have transactions appearing in ascending or descending date order, but given the fact that in Visage you can also click a column and have them sorted by any order you want, that question is somewhat redundant these days. The next choice you get to make is whether you want to allow customers to be shared. This question only relates to those organisations that have more than one entity. As you'll find when you create a customer, you can allocate a customer as notionally belonging to a particular entity. And the question here is, if I have branch A and branch B, or company 1, company 2, whatever, do I want to be able to use a company 1 debtor from within company 2, or do I want to be able to reference a branch B debtor from branch A? Your answer to that question will tell you, and you need to tell the system, whether you wish to be able to allow customers to be shared between entities or not, or whether you want to allow it but also to let the operator know that they're doing it. And that will really depend. Your answer to that question will depend on how your business operates. You also have an option for out of date ranges. If you're entering up transactions within the accounts receivable system, your choices here are basically that if you're entering up a date, that date has to exist within a predefined or already defined general ledger period. We don't care which period it is. You could process a transaction that's dated 3 months in advance, but providing a general ledger period exists for it, we will happily accept the date. You can nominate that you can enter a date through the accounts receivable system, providing that it's on or after the current general ledger periods. In other words, not letting people enter transaction dates through the accounts receivable system into closed general ledger periods. And bear in mind always that if you've closed a period in accounts receivable, you can't process transactions for customers associated with those particular terms prior to that last end of period date anyway. Or the third option is simply to enable a warning message to come up if a debtor, or if you're entering a transaction against a debtor that isn't within the current period, so that at least you are warned of it, or the operator is warned on it. And if they've accidentally entered a date, and this typically happens around December, January each year, where we have a year change, and someone might be in early January entering up a date for December, and they just enter up the date as 20/12, not entering in the year code, because all year they've been used to the date defaulting to the current year, but suddenly the current year is not the year I thought, and I have a transaction dated 11 months into the future. So you can set the system up to give you warnings on that. Now, once the next question is sort of a repeat or something similar to the transaction or the details we had up here in terms of trial balances, and it's really just saying whether the trial balance should include on it a credit limit for a debtor, a fax number, or neither. Just as additional column type things, and that's typically for a summary trial balance. So if someone is actually looking at the trial balance, they want to see how someone is sitting in terms of their credit limit, they can include a credit limit. If they want to chase the people up with copies of invoices that are unpaid or something similar, they may include the fax number, or they can elect to say neither. Next question, once more, dealing with documents. When we have documents, whereabouts do we get the income account, the revenue from that? The options here are to actually get it from the bill code that's being used, to use the sales account associated with a customer, which in turn would default to this sales account that we entered up here on the parameters in the first place, or to use an income account associated with the job table, and that job table is set up in job costing. It's covered across in the job costing area, but basically depending on the activities that are being billed, you can have the system automatically direct income into the appropriate areas of the general ledger. And likewise in terms of the job group types, and I should point out here, at any point in any of the Visage programs, of course, you do have access to the help system, so you can just hit the help if you want to get a refresher. In this case, I want to get a refresher to find out what the job group type is. So it's basically saying that it's got to be a pre-existing job group, and it's only asked if you're using job costing in terms of the document income account, and it's saying effectively which table to go and look up to get those entries from. So in other words, unless you have elected to go and use the table option here for the job table, the job group type can just be left blank. and I would normally get my income from a bill code. That's me personally. Um, Note information, you can ignore this question. It's useful for compatibility, once more, for people using the traditional R5 character-based interface, but it's really just saying whereabouts you're keeping note information, custom notes or telenotes, and telenote doesn't exist. There is no analogy to that within the Visage. Visage has note logs. Don't worry if you don't know what they are yet, you will. But it's really just saying which of those facilities you would have used in the Accuterm version, the character-based version of Visage. The next question, if you were doing contra invoicing. Contra invoicing is where you may have a supplier who's also a customer of yours. And if you owe the supplier $500 and your supplier owes you $200, you may decide to create a contra invoice between these two amounts in the two disparate systems, so that you end up only drawing a check for $300 for him, because you know, it saves checks crossing in the mail, and also if you have any suspicions whatsoever about the supplier or customer, depending on, well, let's view him from the point of view of a customer. If you have suspicions that he may not pay his account normally, it may be best to actually operate one of these contra accounts. So the contra thing is simply nominating the tax code that would be used, and that would always be, if you're operating within Australia, a GST add type account normally, and also what the contra invoice clearing account is. That clearing account, once more, there is going to be transactions entered in both the debtors and the creditors system. We're going to reduce balances in both, and the contra account is simply used as that clearing account that is nominated here to affect those changes in both the debtors and the creditors system. You also finally, or next to finally on this page at least, have the option of nominating what status is going to be used for customers that are actually inactive. Now these statuses, as you'll find out in the accounts receivable system, there are certain flags that you can set against a customer. One of those is a status, and we really need to know which of those statuses that you can establish means that the customer is no longer active. And that's simply so that when you're doing searches and so forth, we can exclude old inactive customers automatically for you. The email text here would be used once more by classic R5 users. It's redundant within the Visage system, so if you are transitioning from the Accuterm character-based version to Visage, you'll see what entries were originally made here, and the information is typically sent out when you are sending copies of documents out to people or invoices, but for Visage it's redundant, so you can really ignore that. That's the first page of information we have in terms of accounts receivable parameters. The next page is much shorter and much easier. We basically have a table of user-defined fields. Now these user-defined fields will apply and appear against customers. If, when you are establishing your customers, it turns out that you need to record some information that we don't cater for. You may need to or want to record a spouse's birthday, how many children someone has, who their current supplier is, any questions that you need to or would like to keep information for relating to your customers. You can nominate here as descriptive tags, and when you see the video for customer maintenance, you'll see where these questions actually appear. But it's really just a way of extending the standard customer maintenance facility to have questions that are specific and useful to your business. The next table over here is a table of protected customers. Now there are certain customer accounts on the system that you don't want people to accidentally make changes to. Ones that spring to mind are cash accounts or accounts for key account holders and so forth, you can nominate these protected customers in this top table. So I probably have a customer called Cash. So by simply entering these customer codes, which you won't have when you're initially setting up your parameters, so this is something that you would initially leave blank. Then once you have your customers established, customers that you don't want people to be able to accidentally make changes on, like a cash sale customer, there may be other special purpose or special use accounts that you have, or just ones that you don't want people to accidentally be able to make changes to. Nominate what those customer codes are in this particular table. Of course, someone, hopefully, probably, needs to be able to get in and make changes to those accounts as required. So you can nominate the user or users that can actually go and reference these protected customers. In this case, I'm going to give myself that facility, and that's all. And speaking of that's all there is to the accounts receivable parameters. So if you are transitioning from classic R5 system, check these parameters to make sure that they correspond to the way that you want to do business now and into the future. And if you are just becoming a member of the Stamina Software family, set these parameters up to reflect the way that you want your system to operate. And most likely, and or if you get stuck, you'll be speaking to someone from Stamina Software in a way. Thank you very much for listening. Bye now.